The Viral arrived in Earth's orbit, their ships hanging like silent titans above the planet, casting shadows on the surface below. The sky seemed to ripple as their craft cut through the atmosphere like nothing humans had ever seen before. Their technology was unlike anything humanity could imagine. Beams of light danced from their vessels, scanning the planet. They knew Earth was a primitive world, one that had barely escaped the chaos of its own wars. But they saw potential, an untapped resource, something to be absorbed into their galactic empire. Like so many before it, their arrival was supposed to be a moment of triumph, yet it was filled with an eerie quietness that unsettled the world's leaders. Earth's governments scrambled to make sense of the sudden appearance of these visitors. Despite their best efforts to monitor the skies for years, they had never prepared for something like this. At first there was hesitation, silence, then disbelief. How could this happen now? How could they just appear without warning? Humanity had learned the hard way to distrust the unknown, to fear what lurked beyond the stars. But this was different. These beings were not hostile, not at first glance. At least the Viral sent an envoy, one that appeared to be nothing more than a figure of light and energy, offering peace, a gesture of friendship to a world that had known only conflict for so long. But Earth was not ready to be subjugated, not now, not ever. Across the globe, leaders from every corner of the planet met to discuss how to respond. There was no clear answer, no single voice speaking in unison. Fear mingled with pride. Some saw this as a chance to prove humanity's worth, to take part in a grand galactic future, while others were already preparing for the worst. Every country held its breath, waiting for the next move, unsure of what the Viral would demand next. On the streets, the people were unsure of what to think. The news showed only the Viral ships hanging ominously above their cities. Experts claimed the aliens were peaceful, but how could they know? How could anyone know? Everything about the Viral was a mystery. Their ships, their technology, their motives. It was all so foreign. Their ambassador, Harthos, stepped forward with an air of calmness, extending an offer for humanity to join their great empire, to share in the knowledge and prosperity that had sustained the Viral for millennia. But in the heart of humanity's governments, a secret plan had already been set into motion, a plan that had been devised in the darkest days of Earth's history, a plan set in place during the Cold War by those who had foreseen the possibility of such a moment. The silent directive was not known to the public, not even to most of the world's leaders. It was a last-ditch effort, a fail-safe in case of an alien invasion, a series of protocols designed to protect Earth at any cost, and now it was activated. As the Viral ambassador spoke to the leaders of Earth, offering peace and the promise of a better future, the directive began to unfold, unseen by the invaders who believed they had already won without firing a shot. The human world was already on the brink of making its move. Unbeknownst to Xarthos, Earth was not the helpless planet they had assumed it was, and they would soon learn that humanity was far more than they had ever imagined. As Xarthos and his delegation waited for the humans to respond to their offer, they were unaware that Earth's leaders had already begun to act behind the scenes. The silent directive was set in motion like a machine that had been waiting for this very moment. The first step was simple but effective. Humans immediately began to scramble their communication channels across the globe. Networks were flooded with encrypted signals that no one on the Viral side could crack, no matter how advanced their technology was. The human resistance began to organize in secret. Messages were passed from government to government, from city to city. Whispers of hope began to spread like wildfire in the underground. They knew the Viral had underestimated them, that the time for peaceful talks was over. The Viral ambassadors stood in front of the United Nations, their ships hanging above the building in a display of undeniable power. Xarthos spoke with all the authority his species could muster, a voice that was calm and confident, and yet carried the weight of ages in every word. He promised prosperity and advancement to all humans who accepted their offer. But what Xarthos did not know was that his words were being heard by millions of ears that were not as ready to submit as he had assumed. Leaders and military commanders across the world were working to coordinate humanity's response. Many of them had access to technologies that were unknown to the feral. Those who had long feared the potential consequences of an alien invasion had prepared for just such a moment. The aliens had overlooked this simple truth. They had failed to see that, while humans were technologically inferior, they had something far more dangerous, a spirit of defiance and resilience that no advanced civilization could understand. As Exarthos continued his speech, his words began to falter. Though he could not see it, his communications were beginning to break down. The encrypted signals from the silent directive had already begun to infiltrate the feral systems, causing glitches and distortions in their network. Without them knowing, humans were gaining access to their technological systems. Their own surveillance satellites began to turn against them. Some of the feral fleet was already under siege as human engineers worked in secrecy, using nothing but their knowledge of the feral technology to sabotage their systems from the inside and outside at the same time. Around the world, in basements and hidden rooms, scientists and military leaders were adjusting their plans, tweaking their strategies, adapting faster than the feral could keep up. Xarthos paused for a moment, sensing a strange disruption in the air. A crackling static buzzed in his communication equipment. His voice faltered for a split second as the signal broke and reformed. This should not have been possible. His ships were designed to communicate through encrypted channels that no human technology should have been able to interfere with, yet somehow Earth's response was reaching him with more force than he could have ever anticipated. But there was no time to question. He carried on with his message, pushing forward, despite the strange sensation creeping into his mind. But the truth was undeniable. The feral were not prepared for this level of resistance. The world's leaders were scrambling not to submit but to fight, and Earth's united front was not waiting for Exarthos to finish his speech. Humanity was already planning their counterattack. The feral had underestimated the strength of a species that had fought its way out of its own darkest days, and now they would soon learn that the greatest mistake was thinking that Earth was just a primitive world waiting to be dominated. As Exarthos continued to broadcast his message to Earth's leaders, the unseen forces behind the silent directive grew more intense. Every action taken by the humans was calculated. Every movement was designed to strike where the feral least expected them. The first phase had already begun to take effect, and the feral had no idea they were already losing control of the situation. The encrypted signals from the silent directive were spreading like a virus through the alien communication network, distorting and scrambling their command systems. Humans had long studied the vulnerabilities of the feral's technology, and now they were exploiting them without mercy. What had once seemed like advanced brilliance was now their greatest weakness. Across the world, human scientists and engineers worked tirelessly to reverse engineer the technology left behind by the feral ships. Strange data began appearing on human screens as they uncovered a trove of alien knowledge that no one had ever thought possible. The feral had arrogantly assumed their technology was impenetrable, but humanity's ingenuity and determination had already begun to turn the tide. A few key breakthroughs had already been made, and human forces were preparing to strike back on every front. Military bases were suddenly receiving unexpected upgrades. The data that had been intercepted from the alien networks allowed Earth's defense systems to adapt quickly to the advanced weaponry the feral had brought with them. The feral hadn't even realized they were under attack. Their communications were still being jammed. They couldn't trace the interference, no matter how hard they tried. And all the while, human forces were arming themselves with alien technology. Each discovery led to another layer of understanding. The deeper the humans dug, the more they realized how vulnerable the feral had made themselves by depending too heavily on their advanced systems, and overlooking the simple fact that their enemies were not passive. They were adapting to the feral's tactics with every move. Back in the feral flagship, Xarthos tried to maintain composure as the disturbance in his communications grew stronger. The disruption was coming from Earth's satellites. The source of the interference was impossible to pinpoint, but it was clear that their systems were being attacked from within. But by what he did not know, and with each passing moment, the feral were losing grip on their control of the situation. Their fleets were slowly becoming isolated from one another. Their strategic advantage was slipping away, and yet they could not fathom how or why. At a global level, Earth's governments began to mobilize not just in defense, but in preparation for something far more dangerous. The Silent Directive was more than just a technological countermeasure. It had been designed to break the psychological resolve of any invading force, to shake their belief in their own superiority, and force them to make mistakes that humans would exploit. The feral were not prepared for the unpredictability of a species that had survived centuries of internal conflict and chaos. They had expected humans to bend to their will to become another cog in their empire, but instead they were faced with an unexpected reaction, a united front, driven by survival and pride. Xarthos now began to feel the first stirrings of doubt within himself as he looked out over his fleet. The once invincible armada seemed far less intimidating. The disruption in their communications was growing worse, and his confidence began to waver. He had expected easy conquest, but now there was no clear path forward. Every step seemed to lead them further into uncertainty, and the humans were still out there adapting, fighting back with a relentless determination that the Viral had never anticipated. The moment the Viral realized their control was slipping, it was already too late. Earth's counterattack had begun, and it was swift. The first strike came from an unexpected direction. A human-led coalition of scientists, military commanders, and engineers had secretly infiltrated the alien infrastructure and sabotaged a key Viral outpost located on the outskirts of a major city. The plan was simple yet bold. Using the alien technology the humans had reverse-engineered, they created an EMP burst capable of disabling the outpost's defenses and rendering it vulnerable to a swift assault. The operation was executed with precision in the dead of night. The Viral stationed at the outpost were caught completely off guard by the sudden strike. Their systems shut down one by one. Without warning, the human forces descended with surgical precision, not with overwhelming numbers, but with the advantage of surprise and ingenuity. They had studied the Viral's tactics and weaknesses, and now they exploited every single one of them. The Viral had relied too heavily on their advanced technology to keep them safe, but in doing so they had become predictable. The humans launched a series of attacks on the Viral's weakest points, taking down communication towers, power grids, and defense installations with shocking efficiency. The Viral were struggling to coordinate a response. Their once flawless systems were now riddled with failures. Their fleet was being targeted by Earth's newly adapted technologies, making it difficult for them to track or retaliate effectively. Every move they made seemed to work against them as they tried to reestablish control. The news of the successful attack spread like wildfire across Earth, giving the people hope and the resistance new strength. The once fractured global alliance now stood united against the invaders. Governments that had once bickered over trivial differences were now focused on a single goal, driving forward with an unstoppable will to protect their planet. Humanity had become a singular force, fueled by a shared purpose. The Viral were no longer the unstoppable invaders they had once seemed to be. Inside their flagship, Xarthos paced back and forth, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the disaster unfolding before him. The humans had struck without mercy, and with a coordination that no one had expected. Their adaptability was beyond anything he had ever witnessed. They had taken advantage of every weakness and every opportunity without hesitation. Xarthos had always believed the Viral were the superior race, but now he wasn't so sure. He had underestimated the will of humanity, and now it was costing them dearly. As Xarthos struggled to regain control of the situation, reports began flooding in from various parts of their empire. The Viral fleet was disoriented. The once unified chain of command had been fractured, and communications were still unreliable. Key military leaders were reporting that their forces were scattered and disorganized. Humanity's tactics were starting to tear the Viral apart from the inside out, and yet they still couldn't find a way to stop it. Meanwhile, human forces continued their relentless assault on vulnerable Viral assets across the globe. Each victory bolstered their morale and the enemy's failures fueled their determination. The world watched in awe as the underdog species began to stand its ground against the most powerful civilization they had ever encountered. Humanity had tapped into something deep within themselves, something the Virile could never have understood: the spirit of survival and the refusal to bow down. As the Virile scrambled to reestablish control, their once immense empire began to fragment. The unity that had held their civilization together for centuries was cracking like glass. With each new defeat, the cracks grew wider and deeper. On one side, there were those who still believed the invasion could be salvaged with more force and discipline, but on the other side, factions began to rise that questioned whether the war could be won at all. Some believed that Earth's defenses were merely a fluke, that their technological superiority would eventually prevail, but others saw something far more troubling in the human resistance. The unpredictability of humanity was their greatest asset. They fought without honor or rules, without fear of failure. They adapted and responded faster than the Virile could calculate. Zarthos found himself torn between these warring factions within his own ranks. Some of his generals insisted that they should withdraw and regroup in order to avoid further losses, while others pushed for a total assault on Earth to crush the resistance once and for all. Yet every plan he considered was met with failure. The human forces were too dispersed, too unpredictable, and with every passing day the Virile seemed less and less prepared for the guerrilla tactics that humans employed so efficiently. In the heart of the resistance on Earth, the leaders of the various nations that had once been divided by political strife now stood together, united by a single purpose: survival. The world had forged an unspoken alliance that had become the cornerstone of their success. Military leaders and civilian experts worked side by side. Scientists and strategists shared resources and knowledge as never before. Even nations with long histories of distrust had put aside their differences to face a common enemy. The silent directive had become not just a plan of survival, but a symbol of the strength that came when humanity stood together as one. The human forces continued their relentless pressure on the Virile, weakening their infrastructure and forcing their armies to fight on multiple fronts across the globe. Every battle the Virile lost added fuel to the growing rebellion within their ranks. Soldiers began questioning their orders, questioning their leaders. They had never been forced to consider failure in such a profound way. Their empire had been built on the belief of absolute superiority, that their technology would ensure their dominance. But now those beliefs were eroding like sand under a tide of human ingenuity. On the Virile flagship, Zarthos could no longer deny the scale of the collapse within his empire. Communication lines were failing again, entire fleets were cut off from each other, and the Virile's once feared weaponry began to malfunction in the face of humanity's constant assault. The alien forces were unable to coordinate their attacks, and each isolated group of Virile soldiers was forced to fend for themselves without support. Their ships were being boarded, their outposts overtaken, their leaders losing influence with every defeat. The fractures were no longer subtle, they were now visible for all to see, and the Virile began to turn on each other. Distrust and fear spread like wildfire among them. No longer was there a unified vision of conquest. There was only confusion and panic. Some factions called for peace, some for vengeance, others simply wanted to flee, but all were paralyzed by their failure to understand the true enemy before them. Meanwhile, the humans did not slow down. Their relentless attack continued, and the Virile found themselves fighting a war they could not win. The more they tried to regroup, the further their empire slipped away. And as the world watched, humanity's resilience had begun to turn the tide. Their enemy was no longer the unstoppable force they had once seemed, but a crumbling empire incapable of fighting back with the strength they had promised. As the Virile scrambled to regain their footing, their situation grew increasingly dire. The fractures in their empire deepened, and their once unified fleet began to splinter under the weight of their failures. What had started as a calculated invasion was now a desperate fight for survival. Zarthos watched helplessly as reports of defeated Virile battalions and lost territories continued to pour in from across their empire. Each new defeat felt like a hammer blow against the foundations of their civilization. The once proud leaders of the Virile now faced an undeniable truth: their technology, which had once seemed invincible, was no longer enough to secure victory against the relentless ingenuity of humanity. Human forces were everywhere, infiltrating their systems and their bases with eerie precision, sabotaging their infrastructure and eroding their control over key locations. Even their fleets were suffering from coordinated attacks. Humanity had learned to exploit the weaknesses in feral technology, using their own creations against them in ways that no one could have predicted. Power grids were overloaded, weapons malfunctioned, and communication channels continued to fall into disarray. The feral could no longer rely on their advanced tech to guide them, and with each passing day the sense of hopelessness grew stronger among their ranks. Yet even as the feral empire crumbled, the humans pushed forward with relentless determination. Now Earth's forces were preparing to unleash their most devastating strike. Yet one final blow that would leave the feral reeling. Their engineers had been working tirelessly to develop a weapon capable of crippling the alien fleet for good. Humanity had taken the pieces of feral technology, they had scavenged and combined them with their own advancements, and the result was a weapon that was both familiar and alien, a series of EMP pulses that could be launched from Earth's orbit, designed to disable the feral's fleet and communications permanently. The plan was dangerous but necessary. Humanity knew that they could not afford to give the feral a chance to regroup, to rebuild their strength. Every day they waited only gave the enemy more time to recover, and with their final strike, humanity was determined to put an end to the conflict once and for all. On the feral flagship, Xarthos stood before the council of his remaining generals. The situation was desperate. They were on the brink of losing everything. Their fleets were disintegrating, and their outposts were falling into enemy hands. His once loyal generals had begun to argue over the next course of action. Some believed they should launch a final assault on Earth, despite the risks, while others advocated for retreat. But no matter what they decided, it was clear that their empire had already lost its former might, and now survival was their only priority. Xarthos knew that retreat was an option, but the consequences were unimaginable. If they fled now, they would lose not only Earth, but their place as rulers of the galaxy. Their pride and dominance would be shattered beyond repair. Still, the internal conflict among the feral was growing more apparent, and at this point, nothing seemed to matter more than saving what little remained of their civilization. Meanwhile, Earth's forces readied their final strike. The EMP pulses were set to launch from their satellite network, and once they were activated, the feral would be completely incapacitated. Their fleets would fall from the sky, and their remaining assets would be rendered useless. In a matter of hours, humanity had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and now there was no turning back. The countdown had begun, and the feral were powerless to stop it. The final strike was coming, and the feral had no way to stop it. As Earth's forces launched the EMP pulses from their satellite network, the feral fleet suddenly went dark. Entire sections of their once imposing ships lost power, and communication channels were severed. The pulse sent shockwaves through their systems like a tidal wave through an already fragile structure. It was as if the heart of the feral empire had been torn out in one swift motion. Their most advanced technologies were rendered useless in a blink, and the remnants of their once unified fleet spiraled out of control. Without their centralized command systems, they were now nothing more than isolated, vulnerable targets. Xarthos stood frozen in disbelief as his flagship trembled under the assault. Communications were down, and his crew scrambled to restore the systems that had once been the lifeblood of their operations. But it was too late. All around him, his fleet was collapsing. The ships that had once been invulnerable to human weapons were now crippled by the EMP pulses. Their shields flickered out, their weapon systems malfunctioned, their engines sputtered to a halt. The might of the feral had been reduced to chaos and disarray. On Earth, the mood was one of cautious optimism. The final pulse had been deployed, and the world held its breath as the EMPs began to spread across the feral's fleet. But humanity had learned long ago not to take victory for granted. As the first signs of success began to trickle in, military commanders and engineers worked to ensure that the victory was complete. They had seen too many battles lost to overconfidence. The humans had learned to anticipate every countermeasure the feral might attempt, and prepared for even the worst-case scenarios. But the reality of their success began to set in as the reports flooded in from all over the globe. The feral fleet was disabled. Their ships were falling from the sky. Their commanders were scrambling to salvage what little they could. The once proud invaders were now nothing more than a broken and disorganized force. The human resistance had not only survived, but had utterly destroyed the Feral's ability to wage war on Earth. Across the Feral ships, panic spread as their leaders struggled to maintain order with no communication with the rest of their forces, no way to coordinate their ships or even report on the status of their remaining weapons. The Feral were adrift in a sea of chaos. Some commanders tried to issue orders, but there was no one left to follow them. Others realized the futility of resistance and began to turn their ships towards escape routes, desperately trying to flee while the humans closed in. Tarthos had seen the end before him, but he refused to admit defeat. His pride as the leader of the Feral Empire would not allow him to accept their fall. Not yet. He ordered his remaining ships to regroup and make a final stand. But even as he did so, he knew deep down that it was hopeless. The humans had already won. Back on Earth, celebrations began to stir across the globe as the initial shock of their victory began to sink in. The Feral were no longer a threat. Their fleet was shattered and their empire in ruins. But humans knew that the fight was not truly over yet. The war had been won, but the future was still uncertain. The Feral were not yet completely gone, and there would be challenges in the aftermath. Rebuilding would take time, but humanity had proven that it could face the impossible and emerge victorious. The battle for Earth was over, but the war for survival in the galaxy was just beginning. The final remnants of the Feral fleet drifted aimlessly through space, their once glorious armada reduced to a collection of shattered ships scattered across the stars. Their leaders had failed, their empire had collapsed, and the invaders who had once believed themselves invincible now found themselves broken and vulnerable. But even in defeat, the Feral were not ready to surrender entirely. They had endured countless battles before, and their pride refused to let them go quietly into the dark. On Earth, humanity's victory was celebrated across the globe, but there was no time to rest, no time to bask in the triumph. The victory had come at a great cost, and the damage done by the Feral's invasion was not something that could be repaired overnight. Cities had been damaged, lives had been lost, and the scars of the conflict would last for generations. The world had fought a long, hard battle to protect itself, but now they faced a new challenge. The Feral were not completely vanquished, and many feared they would return to finish what they had started. Governments around the world convened once again, but this time their discussions were not about war, but about peace. The world had witnessed the destructive power of the Feral, but also the resilience of humanity. The silent directive had united them as never before, and now the task was to ensure that such an event would never happen again. Human leaders began to form a new coalition dedicated not only to rebuilding Earth, but to ensuring that the galaxy itself would be safe from further invasion. Tarthos and the remaining leaders of the Feral faced their last moments of defiance. They had no home to return to, no empire to rebuild. Their people had been decimated and scattered. They were fugitives lost in a universe that no longer had room for them. Their technology was gone, their pride was shattered, and now the only question that remained was whether they would survive at all. But despite the overwhelming odds, they refused to give in completely. Their final escape was a last-ditch effort to flee to the depths of space, where they could regroup and rebuild their strength. A silent hope lingered among the few who remained, that they might one day return to Earth to reclaim what they had lost. On Earth, however, the victory was bittersweet. The humans had defeated the Feral, but in doing so they had awakened something else deep within the stars, something far older and far more dangerous than any alien empire. Earth's leaders now knew that they were no longer alone in the universe. They had proven themselves worthy of survival, but in doing so they had unknowingly sent a message to the galaxy that Earth was not to be ignored. Humanity had survived the Feral's assault, and now they stood as a beacon of strength and defiance in a universe full of unknown threats. As the people of Earth began to rebuild their cities and restore their lives, they also began to look outward towards the stars with a new sense of purpose. No longer would they be passive inhabitants of their world. They would reach out and forge their path among the stars, but they would do so with the hard-earned knowledge that the galaxy was full of dangers, and they would never again let their guard down. The silent directive had ensured their survival, but it had also set in motion a new chapter in humanity's history, a chapter where the fight for survival had only just begun.